My Formative Years in Washington, D.C. 1890 to 1910, Episode 4. A 19th Century Washington, D.C. Love Story. Pearl and the Buffalo Soldier. Prologue. Coleman Family Tree. Being a Negro in America is tough. But we made it. Chapter 1. I came here in a whisper. I was born 1873. Chapter 2. The Perils of Growing Up Black in 19th Century America. Chapter 3. Life in Washington, D.C. 1909. Chapter 4. My Formative Years 1890-1910. Chapter 5. High Society in 20th Century Washington, D.C. 1908. Chapter 6. Educating Washington, D.C. Negroes, 1912. Chapter 7. I Was a Flapper in Georgetown, 1912. Chapter 8. The Buffalo Soldier, 1917. Chapter 9. Top Coleman, 1918. Book information. Pearl and the Buffalo Soldier. John Coleman and Pearl Goodwin Coleman were my grandparents on my mother's family side. Her surname Goodwin was used prior to her marriage to my grandfather, John Coleman. She was born B. 1897, by a midwife in Washington, D.C. and John was said to be born B. 1872, in Vienna, Dorchester County, Maryland. 1880 Census. Robert Coleman, B. 1855, John's father, my great-grandfather, was the son of Hooper, B. 1820, and Mary, B. 1830, Coleman. My great-grandparents, former slaves, also from Vienna, Dorchester County, Maryland. A brief history of African Americans in Washington, D.C. 1800 to 1975. At the dawn of the 20th century, African Americans had created a cultural and intellectual capital. Washington had relatively few Jim Crow laws. Origin of the name Jim Crow laws. However, segregation and racism were endemic. The few existing laws mandated segregation in the public schools and recreation facilities, but not in the streetcars and public libraries. African Americans, therefore, reacted strongly to President Wilson's 1913 to 1921 institution of segregation in all of the federal government agencies. Clashes between African Americans and European Americans reached a fever pitch during the July 1919 race riot, when women and men fought back against violent whites, giving another meaning to the term New Negro. This term usually associated with the cultural renaissance of the 1920s and 1930s. During the Great Depression, 1929, 1939, and World War II, 1939, 1945, the early civil rights movement gained ground. In 1933, the same year that President Franklin Roosevelt, 1933, 1945, began to end segregation in the federal government, the young black men of the New Negro Alliance instituted Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns against racist hiring practices in white-owned stores in predominantly black neighborhoods. The Washington chapter of the National Negro Congress also organized against police brutality and segregation in recreation. Beginning in 1936, the Double V effort, Victory Abroad, Victory at Home, increased civil rights activity. In 1835, Beverly Snow, a free black restaurant owner, allegedly insulted the wives and daughters of white Navy Yard mechanics. In the riot that followed, white mobs destroy the homes, churches, and schools of free blacks. In the wake of the riot, Congress increased the bonds required of free blacks. 1848. 77 slaves surreptitiously boarded the sailing vessel Pearl for a planned escape that was aborted when the ship was captured 140 miles from Washington. In an interesting example of the conflicts involved in class and race, was a free black hack driver, reputedly who blew the whistle on the Pearl. He was angry that one of the slave women aboard had refused his hand in marriage. He was allegedly also angry at others who had tipped him insufficiently when he drove them to the pier. 1850. It becomes illegal to bring slaves into the city for sale, but slaves owned by district families can still be sold. Washington was a hotbed of Southern sympathies during the Civil War. The businessman W. W. Corcoran fled the city during the war, leaving his house in the hands of the French so it wouldn't be seized. And in 1862, the remaining 3,000 slaves in the city were emancipated. In 1869 the city passed a law against racial discrimination in places of entertainment, expanding it the following year to include restaurants, bars, and hotels. 1865. Georgetown and the city of Washington hold referendum on Negro suffrage. Only 1 out 700 voters approved the referendum on Negro suffrage in Georgetown, and only 35 voters approve it in the entire city. Also, 90 years before the Montgomery bus boycott, Sojourner Truth integrated the city's horse cars by simply ignoring a conductor's order to move from the white section. Episode 4: My Formative Years in Washington, D.C. 1890 to 1910. Cardozo High School cheerleaders, c. 1903. Welcome to Washington City. I finally left the country, Carroll County, Maryland. I remember the day I left, as plain as day. Entrance into Washington City, 1898, Independence Avenue and 7th Street, SW, Washington, D.C. Late summer, July 29, 1899, just 6 months before the start of a new year and a new century. I was all of 18 years of age. What a day! I was set for a long and arduous 4-hour journey to Washington City on the old Blue Star Highway up through Waldorf Town, the Carroll County seat. We would go through Clinton, Maryland, in Prince George County, then into Washington City along Southern Avenue. Next, we would go down Pennsylvania Avenue to my temporary rooming house on E Street, SW, near the Washington Naval Yard and the Marine Barracks. Traveling through Waldorf Town was like having a heavy burden lifted off my back. I had finally grown tired of living in the country, and I knew being a big city girl was my destiny. I was determined to prove all of my Carroll County relatives and neighbors wrong that she'll be back, as they wished me good luck and goodbye. I hopped on that buggy wagon with my second cousins, the Proctor girls, and my cousin Johnny Lay, the Waldorf Town Negro blacksmith, and the boyfriend of Sally Mae Proctor. When I got all I had in one bag and hopped on that wagon, I said to myself, I am out of here at last. At last, I am out of here. As we rode along on our trip to Washington City, the anticipation grew as the Proctor girls and I were truly ready to begin this new chapter in our lives. That old mule pulling the wagon on the dirt highway couldn't go fast enough to get us out of Carroll Country. We made sure that we left at daybreak, when the sun came up. The colored weren't allowed to travel at night, and we'd risked the chance of getting shot or hauled to jail for being out at night. The white folk believed that you have no reason to be out at night. And if you were up to no good. We also made sure that it was a clear morning with no fog or dew hanging around so we could see miles ahead for white night riders or robbers. They were usually up to no good coming our way, on this straight road to Washington City. We knew the risk of 3 Negro gals and a colored man traveling on this highway, and we expected some trouble as we passed by the white trash neighborhoods along the way. As we got closer to Washington City, the chance of being robbed by gunpoint by both former Union and Confederate soldiers was imminent. 14th and Pennsylvania Avenue, NW Washington, D.C., C 1890. Johnny had his shotgun perched by the wagon's driver's seat in full view, and he had a .45 caliber pistol lying next to him to protect us from highwaymen. We all knew that he didn't dare shoot a white man if that were the case, no matter what they did to us, but if you were a Negro robber, you were all but dead. So we put our faith in God to protect us, and we hid most of our money down our bosoms and drawers, and kept a few dollars out and available in case we did get stopped by robbers. In that situation, we would just give them the money or valuables and just moved on. It made no sense to die over money or valuables, especially since we foresaw a great future ahead of us living in Washington City. We could always earn it back. And then some. Sure enough, when we reached Clinton, Maryland, right outside of the city, 2 white highwaymen pulled us over and told us that we had to pay a nigger toll to pass through Clinton, Maryland. Life in Georgetown, D.C. We knew that they had no intentions of raping or molesting us women, as we made sure that we looked our worse for the trip by wearing dirty, unkempt clothes. And we also covered our bodies with stinky hog poop so they would only want our money, and raping us would be their least intentions. I said to myself, a nigger toll? What in the hell is a nigger toll? So we paid it anyway with the little money that we had set aside for being robbed, and they let us move on. We didn't want any trouble, but trouble always follows you when you are doing something good for yourself. When we got to the Washington City line, we got told again, this time just for entering the city. I guess this one was a legal toll, but we paid it again and moved on. Johnny said that the next highwayman, either white or colored, that we come up on was going to get shot because he had a right to protect himself in Washington City. Negroes had a right here like everyone else, to bear arms and to protect themselves and their property. Once we crossed that city line out of Maryland, if anyone messed with us, they would pay the price. It was city law, said Johnny. We could shoot them whether they was white or colored. We didn't have any more tolls or trouble once in the city. Once there, we started to see more people, especially colored people. We even saw a policeman or two as we moved down Branch Avenue to Pennsylvania Street, the entrance to downtown Washington City. We saw white policemen and, believe it or not, colored policemen, perched on big black horses keeping the peace. They were dressed all pretty in their blue uniforms that looked quite familiar to the ones that the Yankees wore during the Civil War and after. And they wore pistols right inside of you. They looked good, and they looked like they weren't playing. The Washington City Coloreds had rights in this town. Once an outright slave town, the city had changed since the Civil and the Spanish-American Wars. Dressed Up Washington, D.C. Women c. 1904. There were a lot of colored veterans who had fought in these wars, and they came here looking for the freedom that they had experienced during the wars that being in the Army had afforded them in the South, in the West, far West, and overseas. Colored soldiers and veteran, once exposed to an equal life as white soldiers, would go back to living the ways that they lived in the southern states, so they moved up here to Washington City. The word got out that Negroes lived free in Washington City, that's why I came up here. I didn't see any opportunities to live free in Carroll County, Maryland, but here in this city, it was different. I am not saying that there was no hatred for Negroes here like the South, because in reality the city was still split between colored sections of town and white sections of town. There were even Jewish sections and Chinese sections of town. The laws of segregation were unspoken, but well understood here. I was told by Johnny that if you just kept your place and don't do no rebel rousing, you could do well here and prosper. As we rode down Pennsylvania Street toward downtown Washington, the split between the races was even more noticeable. When we got to Benning Road and Pennsylvania Street, the colored lived on the left side and the Jews lived on the right side of the Pennsylvania Street. Heading northeast past Benning Road towards East Capitol Street, the white section was on the left side of Pennsylvania Street going southwest towards South Capitol Street. There was an unwritten law that coloreds and Jews weren't allowed to live on the left side of Pennsylvania Street and across the Sousa Bridge in downtown Washington. Break that rule, and you would get arrested or even shot. There was one exception to that rule, Berry Farms, where Negroes thrived in an area of squalor and destitution for poor colored people. All along Berry Farms, freed Negro slaves lived in nice houses. There weren't many shanties or shacks until you got to Anacostia Heights where the poor coloreds live. Negroes were packed in this part of Washington City like crabs in a basket. They said to stay away from this rough area where there was a Negro killing or two every night. Negroes were just fighting and killing each other over money, woman, and land. On the main street of Anacostia, Nichols Road, white policemen would stay shy of this section. This section of town was where brothels, bars, and roadhouses fed into the crimes of women of the night, drugs, drinking, gambling and killings. That's why they had colored policemen there and no white policemen. They didn't have any respect for the colored policemen either, and they would shoot them at the drop of a hat. I heard that 3 colored policemen were killed every month in Anacostia. This was not a good job to have there unless you were a real badass. Johnny Lay was a former Washington City policeman who worked Berry Farms and Anacostia for about 10 years. That is how he came to know the area and some of the badasses and criminals who lived there. He said that there were a lot of good people who lived there. He was a real badass himself. Then and still is. Thank God that we had him to bring us up from the country to Washington City, for which he was paid well. Bringing us Negroes from Carroll County and other parts of southern Maryland was his job now, and he made good money doing it. He told us to stay out of Berry Farms and Anacostia unless we were looking for trouble. Georgetown Harbor in southwest Washington City. A Georgetown Street, SW, Washington, D.C. As we crossed the Sousa Bridge on the Anacostia River heading west to downtown Washington City, we passed many areas around Pennsylvania Road and the Capitol where rich white folks, federal government workers and people in the United States Congress worked and lived. The areas I saw were like a dream. With nice houses, classy restaurants, lots of small and large businesses and lots of federal buildings. I saw the Capitol building where our Congress worked to pass government laws, and I even saw the White House where our president lived. One place that really impressed me was the monument to President George Washington. It looked like a big gravestone memorial, built high into the sky with a point at the top. I can't figure how they built something so big. I was told that it was mostly colored slaves and white trash that built the White House and most of the federal buildings during and after the Civil War. Seeing these buildings gave me an idea of how powerful these white folks who ran our federal government are and how much they depended on Negro slaves and other poor folks to get their buildings built. As we continued down Pennsylvania Street, we start to move out of the big city into a more country-like area called Georgetown and southwest Washington City. Georgetown in the 1850s had a large Negro population, including both slaves and free blacks. Slave labor was widely used in construction of new buildings in Washington, in addition to provide labor on tobacco plantations in Maryland and Virginia. I was thanking God that we were headed to live in the Georgetown City section of Washington City. Most Negro residents in Georgetown had lived there since after the Civil War. There were lots of dignified and professional colored people living there. But there was a bad side, where former slaves and poor colored people lived on the southwest side, near the docks on the Potomac River. This area of Georgetown was considered rough, and there were brothels and slimy bars all along the Potomac River overlook. I was warned to stay away from that area and to keep away from R Street West and Wisconsin Avenue South. North of Wisconsin Avenue, T Street and R Street were the fine homes of colored federal government workers and military veterans. Most notably in this area, there were Negroes educators who worked at Howard University and Columbia College City. There were also Negro who owned businesses in Georgetown and down the river in Anacostia, Benning Heights and other colored communities in Washington City. A colored person who lived in that part of Georgetown was considered to be highfalutin and high society. In the Negro community, this part of Georgetown, where I would be living, was the best place for a country colored girls to live and to be safe. There was still split communities as the coloreds lived on the west side of R Street and Jews lived exclusively on the east side of R Street. Neither Jew nor colored could move up beyond 23rd Street North and Wisconsin Avenue East, as this was the white section. Negroes weren't allowed to shop at white and Jewish-owned stores on Wisconsin Avenue and stores north to the Maryland line. Most often we were only allowed to shop in Negro-owned stores, or we could travel by trolley to colored communities in other sections of Washington City. Most of us shopped in those stores, owned by the Georgetown Negro elite or Negroes living in Eckington, near Georgia Avenue, 7th Street and Florida Ave in Northwest. I remember taking the Eckington trolley to grocery shop on 9th Street and on Florida Avenue, another colored section near Howard University and Miners Teacher College. There were two colored high schools at that time. Dunbar High School was where I was a cheerleader during football season, when I went back to get my high school diploma off of North Capitol Street. This was where the light-skinned elite Negroes sent their children in preparation to enter Howard University, where mostly light-skinned Negroes attended. I often wondered why Jewish people, who owned most of the shops and stores, didn't want Negroes shopping in their stores. Then I was told that we would scare off the white folks who shopped in their stores, many of whom felt belittled by shopping with Negroes. Jewish people were just as hated by whites as colored people, but they were the best shopkeepers and owned the best stores, so we couldn't shop in their stores. Most of the time, we didn't have the money to shop there anyway, so there was nothing lost there. Elite Negroes would often pay whites to go to these stores to shop for them so they could get the latest clothing styles and the best merchandise, so we got around that. And don't you dare get caught in Bethesda Town, just north of the city, in Maryland. This was off limits to Negroes, except a few areas where former Negro slave families had deeds to land left to them by their former slave master. Segregation ruled government workers. C/.1911 Washington, D.C. Georgetown wasn't all that bad if you stayed in your place and followed the unwritten rule of Negroes and whites being separated. In most instances, things were pretty equal at times. We were free in Washington City, but everything, or place, was either Negro or white. Negroes couldn't use white folks' public toilets, water fountains, or ride in the front of the trolley cars. In many white areas, there were colored-only trolley cars, so Negro housekeepers and servants in white homes could get to where they worked in the white communities. Negroes weren't allowed to shop downtown at the big stores like Hecht's, Landsberg's, and Cannes, which were owned by Jewish people. They had to keep the store. Shoppers, white or white people, wouldn't shop at their stores. Negroes could clean the stores at night, get jobs as elevator operators, door holders dressed in fine uniforms or night stalkers, but that was it. Around 1911, Negroes were allowed to shop in the downtown store basements, but they couldn't shop upstairs with white folk. The reason was that the Negro elite had money from working good jobs and from running professional businesses that catered to Negroes. We had our own stores in Georgetown, and Negroes could get the same thing there as was offered in the downtown stores. Our stores were often dingy and unkempt, but they had what we wanted. You often paid more for the same items that were cheaper at the downtown stores, but if you figured the cost of the trolley ride downtown, Negroes were willing to pay more. That is why white and Jewish merchants started to sell to Negroes. And they even bought the Negro stores in Georgetown to get at our business. Christmas in Washington City. Trolley car, Washington, D.C. c. 1907. And then there was Christmas time. The downtown stores were always fun and with beautiful Christmas window displays to draw the Christmas shoppers to their stores. We weren't allowed to go down there during the other days of the week, including Sunday. White folks were still suspicious of colored people gathering around in big numbers in the night time. But it seemed that Christmas was a time when whites and Negroes got along real good. You didn't have all the Christmas pageantry and lights in the stores on Wisconsin Avenue, on 9th and T Street or on Columbia Road, so Negroes flocked downtown to see the Christmas lights. During that period of the year, we all got along and things began to get better between Negroes and whites. This was Washington City mentality. Whites, Jews, and Negroes ran their parts of Washington City within the city of Washington City. I needed a job. A rooming house in Old Georgetown. Once in Washington City, I got settled and moved into the Proctor's rooming house on S Street in Georgetown. This was a big white 4-story black shuttered house with about 10 bedrooms and 4 toilets. I took a room on the 2nd floor. That cost me 25 cents per week to live in. This was a nice situation, because room and board, as well as meals were included. My second cousin, Dooley Proctor, and his wife Emily owned this house, and it stayed full all of the time. There were people of all types, coming and going all the time. The Proctors, it was rumored, bought the house with money they had earned running bootleg liquor during and after the Civil War. They were both highly light-skinned, and a little on the rough side, as you had to be if you ran a rooming house. The women were housed on the 1st and 2nd floors for safety reasons, and the men lived on the upper floors. You weren't allowed to have any men or women friends in your room with you alone. These were the rules, and you could get kicked out of the rooming house if you broke that rule. Having the rooms for the women on the first and second floor of the house was important, as the proctors posted guards at a door that lead to the men's section on the third and fourth floor. The long hall to the steps leading to the first floor was always monitored by the guards, day and night. If you met someone that you wanted to be with, you had to meet in the parlor with a chaperone, and you had to sit across from each other while you talked. If you wanted to do hanky-panky, that was okay, but you had to rent a separate room for your rendezvous in the basement for 20 cents per hour. No hanky-panky was allowed upstairs in your room. These folks were smart business people, and they knew that someone was likely to meet up with someone living in that house, brothel. They figured out a way to make money off of that without allowing the house to be turned into a brothel. Few people took up the offer because if you did, you would be watched that much closer for additional rendezvous. They didn't discourage it, but they didn't want you to do this often. Mrs. Proctor said, if you got to do this often, then you should get married and get your own house. Mostly, they wanted you to rent the room, get a job and stay out of trouble. No liquor was allowed, no reefer, no loud parties, and no hanky-panky by the guest unless you occasionally did it in the basement. If you did it with someone, soon everyone in the house would know it, as it would be discussed under a whisper at breakfast or supper in the big 10-chair table dining room. Get a job, go to work and stay out of trouble. Columbus Flour and Feed Store. I came to Washington City to start a new life. The proctor's advice for new roomers like me was to get a job, go to work, and stay out of trouble. That was it. Plain and simple. Most of the women in the house added something additional: find a husband with money. What was important to me was finding a job. I wasn't going to stay in Carroll County and work on a farm cropping tobacco, picking crabs in a crab factory, or shucking oysters. Negroes are doing well here in Washington City. I got my first job working at Columbus Flour and Feed Store, located at 115 E Street SW. Mr. Columbus Scriber was a young colored man freed in 1853. He had been running his store and businesses since 1863, or nearly 40 years. I worked as a store assistant where I would help the store patrons to find what they needed. I learned a lot here with Mr. Scriber. He was a good businessman and person who worked hard for everything that he owned. That included 3 other businesses, a blacksmith shop, a wholesale business, and a restaurant that served Southern cooked foods that appealed to colored people in the community. He served country-style fried chicken, pork ribs, pig feet, hog maws, collard and mustard green, cooked in smoked ham pork, and his country-style biscuit just melt in your mouth. They were homemade, made with real butter, and with so much butter that you didn't need to butter them. All you need was the syrup or honey to sop them in. The cooking was just like you got in my home down in the country. I ate my lunch there every day. I worked there because he took good care of the people who worked for him. People, Negro and white, would come from miles around to buy stuff from Mr. Scriber because of his reputation of being honest and honorable. I felt really lucky to get hired there. He and his wife, Miss Hattie Scriber, were both fair to me, and they taught me a lot. During the years that I worked there, the businesses grew, and the Scribers needed a bookkeeper and accountant to keep track of their money transactions. They chose me to do this job. They kind of adopted me as their daughter because they didn't have any children. The ones that they had was a daughter who died during childbirth, a son who was shot and killed trying to escape from slavery in 1863, and another son who killed himself rather than being a slave. These were strong people who had been through a lot. Mr. Scriber freed himself in 1853, and even though he could not free his wife and children at that time, he made a commitment to himself and to God to never be beholden to any man ever again. Those were fighting words at that time, and he could have been hung for saying that, but he meant it, and that is why he went out and started his own businesses. Now the Scribers wanted me to be their bookkeeper and accountant, so I had to get bookkeeping and accounting training after I finished my high school diploma. The Scribers wanted me to attend Howard University to get my bookkeeper and accounting degree, and they were willing to pay for it. The only requirement was that I would continue to work for them while in school, and that I would work for them as their bookkeeper and accountant when I finished at Howard University. I was a little nervous about going back to school for 4 more years to get my diploma, but I was told that Howard University was one of the best Negro colleges in the United States. So, I took them up on their offer to send me to college. So every day for 4 years, I would get up at 6 a.m. to catch the Eckington Street trolley in Georgetown and ride to Georgia Avenue in Upper Northwest. When I got off of the trolley at Georgia Avenue and Florida Avenue, I walked the rest of the way past Miners Teacher College Dormitory to my classes at Howard University. Next to Howard University was Miners Teacher College, a colored teachers' college where colored women attend to become teachers and to get their degrees. Howard University, the Minor Hall Dormitory of Howard University, 1893. I had often dreamed of being a school teacher, but I decided to stick with the Scriber's offer because I was assured of a good job after I graduated. I also knew that as the Scribers got older and with no children, they may consider me to run their businesses. On Sundays, I would take the day off, but be right back up on Georgia Avenue to go to the Howard Theater to see the latest Chitterling Circuit musicians and troubadour bands. They would come through town from playing shows in the big cities of New York and Chicago. I had a ball there, and I tried to see every group that played at the Howard Theater. My future looked good in the 1900s, and after graduating in 1899, I went to work full-time for the Scribers. I was still a young 22-year-old woman with bright ambitions. I knew that God had a future in store for this whisper baby, born out of wedlock in Carroll County, Maryland, and I was determined to fulfill my destiny. I was a determined country girl who had intended to take Washington City by storm. We kept to ourselves. Cardozo cheerleaders, circa 1889. I had lots of new friends now. In the early years of living in Washington City, I didn't really pay attention to the sting of segregated Washington City. We had our own communities, schools, businesses, and churches. If you had book smarts and light skin, you could make it in Washington City. Most upper-class Negroes were educated, and they sent their children to the best high school at that time, the colored Dunbar High School in Northwest Washington, off North Capitol Street. You had to be light and bright to attend this high school, as the colored divided themselves and their communities according to skin color. The lighter you were, the better chance you had of being someone. You didn't even think of putting your black foot in Howard University if you were dark-skinned, or if you were not the child of the Negro elite, doctors, educators, federal workers, or business owners. Howard was for upper-class and mostly light-skinned Negroes. Fortunate for me, I was light-skinned, and the Scribers were both Howard graduates, so I didn't have a problem getting into the university to study. I went to school with these elite children, and they were my friends. I went to class with them, to parties with them, and I was a cheerleader for the football team. Being with these types of educated people helped me to be who I am. I didn't like the way that our own Negro people treated dark-skinned people and people who were not in the elite class of colored people. I guess that some people just needed someone to look down on. and who they can say that they aren't as good as me. I didn't make any difference, as some whites also felt the same by seeing all of us Negroes as being colored, stupid, low-life, dumb and lazy despite our elite ambitions in the Negro community. A law passed in 1913, by our then President of the United States Woodrow Wilson, opened the eyes of a lot Negroes and showed us how some white folks really felt about us Washington City Negroes. I had moved here to get a good job in the federal government, but the President ended that dream for all of us in 1913 to 1921 by banning Negroes from getting jobs in the federal government. Now who is better than who? These federal government jobs paid well, as you could move up the ladder from a GSA-1 to a GS-5 based on your time working for the federal government and the time you worked there. You could start as a GS-1, where you made 20 cents per hour or $8 per week for a 40-hour work week. That was good money back then, as I was only paying 50 cents per week to rent a flat that I had moved to in the colored section of Southwest Washington. You could move up to a GS2 at 22 cents per hour or $8.80 per week, then to GS3 at 25 cents per hour or $10 per week, and you could move up to GS5 at 30 cents per hour or $12 per week if you were good, if you worked for the federal government for at least 10 years and you had the skills. This was good money back then. But President Wilson stopped that dream by banning Negroes from getting jobs with the federal government. He said that we was taking the jobs from whites. I could afford a flat for $2 per week and I would still have money left over to buy food, fancy outfits, and to go out to the clubs or the Howard Theater on U Street. But too many Negroes were doing this and the whites got jealous, so the President put a stop to Negroes getting good federal jobs. Lots of Negroes were moving up from the South to Washington City looking for federal jobs, and many were held back and many of them returned home. You didn't ever expect to go past GS5. In most cases, you had to be either a doctor or have a doctor degree just to reach GS5. At least that was something to shoot for, but now, all federal government jobs and opportunities ended. Those who had been hired prior to the new law could keep their present jobs, but no new jobs were offered to Negroes. Sometimes, you could get a federal job if you knew somebody, but few country Negroes knew somebody who was that important. There were some Negroes who got as high as a GS9, but they were mostly judges and doctors who specialized in something the federal government needed. GS9 federal government employees made 40 cents per hour or $16 per week. With that kind of money, you could buy a nice home near Howard University where most of the professors lived. Or you could move to nice homes on L, M, or N Street on the outskirts of the city, to Upper Berry Farms or off Central Avenue near the Maryland line. If you got a good government job in Washington City, you were set for life. All you had to do was to be good, don't get into any trouble and don't go around showing off what you had. Most elite Negroes did do that, so the white folks got jealous. They wanted Negroes to stay in their place. If they had, we all would have done fine. But Negroes were fighting tooth and nails to get any job in 1914 as the President's law took effect and no one could find a good job. They were fighting like crabs in a basket for any job as things got really tough for colored people. Some Negro women would do anything for a good government job. Yes, anything. I was lucky, because I had my Howard University degree in bookkeeping and accounting, and there weren't many Negroes or white people around Washington City who had these skills. So because I had these skills, I could get a job with the federal government despite the ban on Negro employment of federal jobs. My mother used to say this: life isn't about what happened to you, but it is about how you handle what happened. Getting that degree was the best thing that I could have ever done. Thanks to Columbus Scriber, a former slave, he gave me these opportunities. Some Negroes let Old Man Wilson stop them in their tracks with his ban on Negroes in federal government jobs. They couldn't foresee other opportunities and other ways to get around these obstacles in life. I worked for the Scribers until 1923, when white businesses started letting Negroes shop in their shops and stores. This started to hurt Negro businesses, and Mr. Scriber began to lose many of his businesses, except his restaurant, that he moved up on Florida Avenue in Northwest. It thrived and grew bigger than all of his old businesses combined. Fate had brought me this opportunity of meeting the right people at the right time. I was so valuable to them at this time that they were paying me 18 cents per hour, close to $8 per week salary, and later as much as $12 per week to work for them. My faith in God that I learned in the country, my beliefs, and my abilities helped me to overcome the obstacles others face from hatred and segregation. I learned that mean and ignorant people couldn't take away the knowledge that was yours to have, especially when your knowledge was of true value to others. I knew I had taken the right road in moving up to high society in the Negro community. I was smart, educated, and light-skinned. I had everything I needed to be successful in whatever I wanted to do in Washington City. Next episode: High Society in 20th Century Washington, D.C., 1908. Episode 5. D.C. High Society, 1890s. Just about everything that you need to know about the lives of African Americans in the 19th century. 19th Century African American Life History Series. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Living in Washington, D.C. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Plantation Living. Online 19th Century African American History Series. The Great Migration North. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Jim Crow Laws. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Emancipation Proclamation. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Buffalo Soldiers. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Educating Black Children in the South. A 19th Century Washington, D.C. Love Story. Pearl and the Buffalo Soldier. Grandmother Jane. An American Love Story in 19th Century Richmond, Virginia, 1848 to 1938. Booker T. Isms. Educator, orator, ex-slave, Republican, 1856 to 1915. Online 19th Century African American History Series. Quotes by Booker T. Washington. Since 2008 we have trained the staffs of thousands of organizations nationwide. Author D. Harold Green is the owner of Workshop SCO, our 18th year Faith Institute, headquartered in Jacksonville, North Carolina, is one of only two African American owned, national and international education technology training companies in the United States. The goal of Skilled Force JOB National Community Trainer Academy is to develop a full-time national community-centric workforce readiness, entrepreneurship, and life preparation skills, soft skills, Train the Trainer Academy program. Visit our website at https://www.faithinstitute.org/about-us.html. Our workshops can teach students how to work in a manufacturing plant, or they can learn how to start their own manufacturing business. D. Harold Green, CCMT. More comments about our workshops. We train trainers, that's what we do. A simplified online training infrastructure, simplified certificate training, easy access online workshops, reduced training costs, reduced days off for training. We offer Workshops Go 19th Century African American Life History Series. Reduced travel expenses for training, access to over 200 online workshops, workforce readiness skills, start a business skills, life preparation skills. Workshops Go 19th Century African American Life History Series. No setup fees. Start immediately. Specify single workshops. $4,799, 100 plus attendees. $5,949, 150 plus attendees. $7,969, 200 plus attendees. 1-year subscription plan. We train trainers, that's what we do. For more information contact D. Harold Green, CCMT. Workshops Go, a division of Faith Institute of Entrepreneurship Incorporated. Jacksonville, North Carolina, 285-40910-679-4319. Email trainers@faithinstitute.org.